Hey guys, welcome to chapter 7. In this first section, I have actually broken it down into two parts. The first part, we are going to talk about the anatomy of the eye. And then in the second part, we will talk about diseases and disorders of the eye. So the eye is actually about 1 inch in diameter, about 2.5 centimeters, and it has a spherical shape. Obviously, it's 3D. It has external structures and internal structures that help protect the eye and also to send stimulus to the brain and signals to the brain so that it can give you the image of what you are seeing. So let's talk about some external structures. As you know, the eye is probably one of the most delicate parts of our body, and because of that, it needs to be well protected, and it is. The eye is surrounded by an eye socket, which is basically the bony material that is indented into our skull. And then the eye also has an eyelid that covers the on top of it, which is what you use to blink. We also have eyebrows. If you don't know, an eyebrow is actually pretty important for your eye as a shield because if there's sweat dripping from your forehead, it actually is used as a way of protection so that it doesn't go directly into your eye. You can usually be caught by your eyebrow hairs. Or give you enough time to wipe it away. And then the eyelashes also help to kind of keep dust particles away from your eye and protect it in that way. All right, we also have structures in our eye that kind of lubricates the eye because the eye has to remain moist in order to be functional. People who have dry eye can have really bad irritations. It can get very itchy, very painful, and even infected. So the one thing that the first gland that we're going to talk about that lubricates the eye is actually located inside the eyelids. So the eyelids, like I said, close over your eye, and on the inside part of your eyelid, you have something called tarsal glands. And these glands are known as sebaceous glands because they produce an oily secretion. So usually you'll learn about sebaceous glands on your skin and like stuff like that because they secrete oil. And these oil secretions have another name, and they're called mebium. And this is also used as a form of protection. The second gland is called ciliary glands, and these are basically modified sweat glands, and these are going to be located between your eyelashes. Let me write the S on there. They are modified, like I said, they're located between your eyelashes. So even if you look at your eyelashes, they kind of look pretty close together, but in between them, you do have these ciliary glands, and they are also important to keep your eye lubricated. And then you have something called the conjunctiva, which basically is an external membrane that is going to cover the eyeball, and it's going to also line the eyelid, and this is going to secrete kind of this mucousy lubrication for your eye. So that's kind of like the clear membrane that you can see on your eyeball. Sometimes if you get an eyelash in your eye and you touch your hand on your eyeball to kind of get it out, whenever you do that, make sure your hands are clean. That's kind of what you're touching, that gooey membrane. There are pictures on page 239, figure 7.1, that kind of clearly show this much better than the image that I have right here. But basically, let's look at the different glands that I just talked about. So here is the tarsal gland. You can see that the eyeball on the right is closed, and so you can see the tarsal gland is that yellow image that is right here. It's on the inside of the eyelid. And then you have your ciliary glands, which are right between your eyelashes. So your ciliary glands are right here, and they're going to be located right between your eyelashes. Your conjunctiva is this clear membrane that covers your entire eyeball. And you can see that it's covering on the front part. It's not on the inside of your eyeball, but just mainly on the front part of it. And then we will talk about lacrimal glands in a bit. Okay, so lacrimal glands are pretty much on the lateral ends of each eye. Remember, lateral is away from the middle part of your face, so it's towards your ears. And these are what are going to be in charge of releasing tears. Remember, tears are these salty, kind of watery substance. And the tears are going to be released through these excretory ducts that are part of these glands. And these are the tears are super important because they contain antibodies and also an enzyme called lysozyme. And these are very helpful in attacking the bacteria that could infect your eye. And the tears only lubricates the surface of the eye, which is basically what you can see of your eyeball, so that it can keep it clean. It will not affect the interior part of your eyeball. All right, so tears can be flushed into the lacrimal canaliculi, which is basically, if you kind of sounds like a canal. And it's in the medial corner of your eye. So if you look at your nose, it's the little dip of your eye that's closest to your nose. And this is, they're going to drain from the canaliculi into the nasal lacrimal duct, which will then lead into the nasal cavity. So if I break down the passage of tears, they're going to be released from the excretory ducts. They're going to flow into the lacrimal caniculi, which is the little dip at the end of each of your eye towards your nose. They're going to go into your nasal lacrimal ducts and then into your nasal cavity. And that's why a lot of times when people get really teary-eyed or really emotional, your nose gets super runny, because that's pretty much how your teardrops are kind of draining into there, and they're going to come out partly through your nose. So if you look at it here, we have your lacrimal gland up here that will secrete the tears. Then they're going to come out of your excretory ducts, and then they will flow into your lacrimal canaliculus, and then into your nasal lacrimal duct, and then into your nasal cavity, and then it will flow out of your nose. So that's pretty much the process of how tears work in your eye. Now, when you have an irritation in your eye, you tend to produce some tears so that it can kind of help wash away any foreign substances that might be stuck in your eye, that might irritate your eye. But if you have a large output of tears being made, and they cannot drain into your lacrimal caniculi fast enough, it will outpour from your eyes and run down your cheeks. And so, usually when you're crying a lot, that's usually what happens. If there's not enough drainage that's happening, so they're leaking onto your cheeks, and you have a runny nose as well from that. So your eye have 6 extrinsic muscles. You can see these in a really clear image on page 239, figure 7.2, sorry. And basically these extrinsic muscles are attached to the outer surface of the eye, and these are what are going to help the eyeball actually move in your socket. So we're going to look at these muscles. Okay, so if you see CN, just think back to your cranial nerves that we talked about, because remember, there were certain cranial nerves that were associated with eye movements, like cranial nerve number 3. So the first one is called the superior rectus, which is going to be involved with upward eye motion. Then you have your inferior rectus, which is going to be to do with your downward eye motion. So remember, superior is always up, inferior is always down, so you can kind of relate that to how the eye is going to move depending with these muscles. So superior rectus muscle is going to help the eye move upward, inferior rectus muscle is going to help the eye move downward. Medial is going to, remember, move the eye towards the middle, or medial movement. And then you have inferior oblique, which is going to help the eye move upward, and lateral eye motion. So remember, lateral is away, so it's going to go towards kind of your ears rather than towards the middle of your face. Then you have superior oblique, which is going to be downward and lateral eye movement. And then you have lateral rectus, which is going to be your lateral eye motion. All right, so let's talk about internal structures. We just finished talking about external structures. The internal structures are pretty much what the eyeball is actually made out of. So the eyeball is actually hollow, but filled with a fluid that's aqueous and vitreous humors. So I'll kind of show you where these two are, but these two humors are actually very important in keeping the eyeball shape. So if you look over here, you can see that the aqueous humor is the one that's in front of the pupil, and then the vitreous humor is the one that's kind of filling the majority of the inside of the eyeball. Okay, so the eyeball actually is made up of 3 tissues in the walls of the eyeball itself. The first one, called the sclera, is pretty much the outermost layer of the eyeball, and it's very tough. It's pretty much the white of the eye that you see. And in the sclera, you have the cornea, which is pretty transparent. It's called the window of the eye. There is no blood supply that actually goes to the cornea, but the cornea is also very important because it's easily transplanted from one body to the next. So you can donate your cornea, if someone has passed away, they usually donate the cornea of that person because it can be easily transplanted into somebody else and give them vision, and your body will not reject it because it doesn't have like specific tags that your body pretty much looks for, versus if you're donating a liver or some other organ, there's these things called tags that you have to fit with the body that it's coming from, with the body that you are trying to transplant it into. So it gets really complicated, but not so with the cornea. It's very easy to be planted. There is no body rejection to these. The choroid is also the middle layer of the eyeball, and it contains a very rich supply of blood to nourish the eye, and this is also what gives the eye a kind of crimson/purple pigmentation, and kind of darkens the interior of the eye, and this also prevents light reflections from happening. Okay, so the choroid is the middle layer of the eyeball, and this is going to have a rich supply of blood, which is pretty much what is nourishing your eye, and it actually gives it a kind of crimson/purple color in the inside of the eye, and this also prevents light reflections from happening so that you can get accurate portrayals of the image that you're viewing. The iris is part of the choroid, okay? And it gives the eye the color that it has. And it also helps to adjust the size of the pupil, and the pupil is the opening that the light is actually coming through to the interior of the eye. Now, there are 2 muscles within the iris that help to control the amount of light that's actually going through it. One of them is called the sphincter papillae, which is going to contract when there is a lot of bright lights happening. And as it contracts, it's going to focus, it also contracts to focus on close objects. And as this is happening, the pupil actually gets smaller. And then you have the dilator pupillae, which basically contracts in the presence of dim light. And it's going to contract to focus on distant objects as well. And then in this contraction, the pupil is going to get bigger. All right, guys, the retina is the innermost layer of the eye. This is going to be all the way in the back, so the posterior part, but it's also going to be anterior to the choroid. And this is where you have a lot of light-sensitive nerve endings. And these nerve endings are going to send the impulses that you get from the visual images through the optic nerve. The optic nerve is then going to convey the message to the occipital lobe that is in your brain, which is where the visual image is actually interpreted. The sensory cells in the retina are called rods and cones. So the rods are actually used to see in dim light. So in dark, when it's dark, when there's not much light going on, when you don't have that much color. And then cones are used to see in really bright light, and they are also what give way to color vision. A lot of people who are colorblind or have issues with seeing color, they have some kind of issues with their cones. And that's why this happens. And then there are also nerve ganglions and bipolar neurons that also connect to the retina and to the rods and cones to help with sending impulses. Okay, so there's something called an blind spot that you have on your retina in each of your eye. They're not located in the same spot in both of the eyes, which is really important so that when you combine both of your eyes' images together, they kind of balance out each other's blind spot so that you're actually seeing a whole image. So the blind spot on the retina is called the optic disc. And the optic disc is pretty much where it's like the juncture between the optic nerve and the eye. And this is where you have no rods and you have no cones, and so you're not getting any signal to be transmitted to actually create a visual image. And that's why it's called a blind spot. And this is pretty much what I just said. Each eye has a blind spot, but they're not at the same spot. Usually when they tell you to check your blind spot, they make you cover one of your eye so that you can tell where it is in each of your eyes. And then because they're not in the same spot in each of your eye, this helps to balance it out so that you can get the full visual field, because they kind of help balance each other out. Okay, so the lens is going to be behind the iris, and this is going to be transparent, and it's also going to be flexible. And it's going to have a slight curve on either side, and it's going to be held in place by something called suspensory ligaments that are kind of around the lens. And the ligaments, which help to keep the lens in place, are going to attach to a ciliary body, which is going to merge with the choroid layer. And the ciliary body is important because this is what it's going to contract and actually change the shape of the lens so that you can actually see different objects at different distances. So instead of kind of describing everything that's involved in vision, I kind of just wrote down the order that this happens. So let's go through the order of vision. Okay, so for vision to occur, first you need to have light, right? Some sort of light has to be bouncing off some kind of object in order for you to actually see the object. Then the light is going to be reflected off the object, and it's going to first go through your cornea. Once it goes through your cornea, it's going to go through your pupil, and then it's going to go through your lens, which is the opening into pretty much your eyeball. Once the light goes through your lens, it's going to go through and hit your retina, which is on the back of your eyeball. Now, the retina is what is made up of rods and cones. Remember, rods is used to see in dim light. Cones, you can kind of think of see and cones with the C in color, because cones is used to see images in bright light and also to see color. Then the image information that is now formed on the retina is going to be sent through the optic nerve. And then the optic nerve is going to pretty much go into the optic chiasma. The optic chiasma is simply where the optic nerves cross. Once they go through the optic chiasma, they're going to go through optic tracts, which are pretty much all of the nerves that are exiting the optic chiasma, and these are what are going to actually carry the information to the occipital lobe. And if you remember, the occipital lobe is in the brain, and that's where whatever image that was first displayed on the retina is going to be interpreted. So you're going to say, okay, the image of me watching this video is now being interpreted in my occipital lobe through all of this process. Okay, so that's pretty much it for how you see with your eye and all of the anatomy parts of your eye that kind of go into you actually being able to interpret whatever it is that you're seeing.